vocabulary that is optional versus non-optional might make a big neural difference. Hey, imagine taking the same route home from work every day for a year. Now compare that to randomly trying different routes on different days for that period. The habit of taking the same route nudges your brain to notice things about that particular route that you might miss if you always changed up your routine. You can think of this as a type of neural commitment that guides your brain to experience and notice certain things. Okay, at this point, you might be thinking, big deal. What does it matter that people habitually notice different things about snow, let alone snow blowing sideways? Fair enough, so let's kick it up a notch. Let's switch to a different language and perhaps a more relevant mental habit. As you know, I'm learning Japanese. One of the big challenges I'm facing is learning all the specific language that has to do with social relations. It's really hard. Japanese has extensive vocabulary and morphology that highlight your place in the social world. In some cases, the exact same verb is marked by different suffixes according to your social status in a situation. For example, the generic translation of I speak is hanashimasu. Now, suppose you were an employee in a company and you had to give a report to your boss. In this case, you would preface what you are about to say with ohanashi itashimasu, which roughly translates to allow me to humbly speak. But now suppose you are rounding up fellow employees for a meeting where the boss was going to make an announcement to the company. In this case, you'd have to say ohanashi ni narimasu, which roughly translates as boss will honorably speak. Same verb, different suffixes. And the job of these suffixes is to make clear the social hierarchy between who's doing the talking and who's doing the listening. These are called honorifics, and you can think of them as linguistic signals that highlight and honor your role in any social situation. Now, we have these in English too, but they're different in a couple of big ways. For one, they don't affect verbs and they're not marked by morphemes. They're usually standalone nouns or adjectives like Mr. and Mrs., Doctor and Professor, Your Majesty and Madam President, and so on. The second reason is that the use of English honorifics is highly variable, especially in America. I have Colgate colleagues who explicitly tell their students never to refer to them as professor. And I know others who would bristle at students calling them anything but professor. And then there are those who don't care one way or another. The important thing is that all of these are perfectly acceptable. So what's all this have to do with linguistic relativity? Well, in addition to these linguistic differences, Japan and America have some big cultural differences. Respecting your place in the social order is an explicit value in Japan, whereas in America, it's much more fluid. In fact, many Americans reject social hierarchies and actively try to disrupt them. So you could say that the two countries represent opposite ends of a continuum in this regard. Now, here's a great Whorfian question. Is it possible that these different value systems are influenced by the different honorific patterns of the two languages? The idea is this. If you use honorifics all the time in Japan, you're constantly being reminded of your social position with respect to others. Add to this that Japanese honorifics are often accompanied by the physical activity of bowing, another custom in Japan, and you have a prime candidate for embodied language shaping the brain. I think this is a much more compelling case than the snow example, don't you? At least on the face of it, it makes sense how using honorifics may strengthen certain cultural habits of mind. However, you may have spotted another problem, a bigger problem. How can we be sure that it's the honorific structure of the language that's influencing the cultural value and not the other way around? Isn't it equally possible that a culture that values structured social order would create a linguistic system that reflects that order? This is the gist of the argument that John McWhorter presents in his 2014 book entitled simply The Language Hoax. I told you, the Whorfian hypothesis spurs some pretty strong reactions. McWhorter's critique is that language merely reflects culture, and it's culture that does all the heavy lifting in influencing thought across different groups. Let's explore this critique in another well-known example, Let's go from language and social hierarchies to language and spatial cognition. The UC San Diego cognitive scientist Lera Boroditsky is fond of doing the following demo in lecture halls around America. She asks the audience to close their eyes and point due north. If you can, pause and try it yourself. If you're like the audiences in Boroditsky's talk, you likely had a lot of trouble with this seemingly simple task. By the way, I myself have tried this demo many times in my own Intro to Psychology courses, and it's always interesting to see students pointing in every possible direction. Not only that, it's a bit embarrassing. Before each demo, I need to Google my own classroom just to make sure I have it right. It's really hard. Okay, now contrast this ignorance with the behavior of an Aboriginal community in northern Australia. The community lives in Pormpuraaw, on the western edge of Cape York, and the primary language is called Cook Theori. The language is different from English in how it describes spatial relations. Rather than relying on relative spatial terms like left and right, it uses absolute spatial terms like north, south, east, and west. And this is not just for large-scale directions like, we are east of the ocean, but it's for all directions. So you would say that the spoon is to the west of the bowl, or the person north of my wife is my sister. Interesting. Well, here's what's really interesting. It appears that speakers of Cook Theori also happen to be very good with cardinal directions. If you asked them to close their eyes and point due north, they'd have little problem. In fact, the linguistic anthropologist Stephen Levinson has a great video of a girl from Pormpuraaw who correctly identifies directions even after being blindfolded and spun around 5 times. I've seen this video with my own 2 eyes. It's striking. And apparently the girl is among many in the community who can do this. To systematically test these spatial abilities, Levinson and colleagues have conducted a series of field experiments in Pormpuraaw and other places where people use absolute directions in speech. As a comparison group, they also tested Dutch speakers in the Netherlands who use relative spatial terms like we do in English. The basic method was to present speakers of both languages 3 small objects in a row. For example, from the speaker's perspective, a pig would be placed on the left, a horse would go in the middle, and a dog would go on the right. Then, subjects were asked to move to the other side of the building and rotate 180 degrees so that they were facing in the exact opposite direction from before. After they moved, they were given the same 3 objects again and asked to reconstruct the sequence as they remembered it from before. So where would you put the pig? If you're like Dutch speakers, you'd probably say to your left, where it was before. But that's not what the Cook Theori speakers did. They put it to their right. Why would they do that? Well, this is much less puzzling if you stop thinking in terms of left and right and start thinking in terms of north, south, east, and west. If you held a compass when you did this, it'd make a lot more sense. Let's say the pig was originally the furthest west of all 3 objects. Well, when you rotated 180 degrees, it'd still be the westernmost object, right? So it seems that Cook Theori speakers carry around a virtual compass in their heads. By now, I bet you're applying the Whorfian logic on your own. Because Dutch speakers, like English speakers, habitually use left and right terms to describe spatial relations, they encode that information in memory relative to themselves. In contrast, because Cook Theori speakers habitually use absolute terms for space, they encode that information in a compass-like way. What would McWhorter say about all this? Can you think of any other reason why people living in the Australian wilderness might be particularly good at absolute directions? Isn't it possible that people who live off the land and sea need to rely on major geographical landmarks to navigate their environment? McWhorter would argue that the landscape of Pormpuraaw is ideally suited for cardinal directionality, and their language simply reflects this fact. In contrast, Westerners like the Dutch live in a landscape where absolute directions may not be the best way to describe and categorize space. After all, with so much of Western life operating indoors, large-scale landmarks are less prominent and can't always be counted on. This may naturally lock in relative spatial terms like left and right as the most useful form of language in these cultures. So maybe it's the physical environment that affects thought and not the language. This possibility is real trouble for linguistic relativity. Now that you're getting the hang of it, let's do one more to finish up. Let's talk about color. This is a favorite in the Whorfian literature. Have you ever had one of those 2 a.m. philosophical conversations where you ask, do you see color in the same way I do? Is your blue the same as my blue? Well, let's put a Whorfian twist on this question. Do people see blue because they have a word for blue? This is actually not as out there as it sounds. It makes some sense when you consider that not all languages have words for every color. Any trip to the paint store will tell you that. And even some standard color words in English are relatively new to the language. Did you know that blue itself made its appearance relatively recently? Only after the arrival of other color words like white and black, and then red, yellow, and green? Debbie Roberson and her team at the University of Essex studied color words of a community of cattle herders in Namibia. They found that the herders' language, Herero, does not have as many color words as we do in English. Whereas English has 11 basic color terms, Herero has only 5. For example, the single word Zuzu subsumes a range of darker colors that English speakers would call dark blue, dark green, dark brown, dark purple, dark red, or black. It also turns out that the Herero speakers do not sort colors the same way English speakers do. So if I were handed 50 painted chips with all 11 color categories in English, I'd sort them into 11 different piles. However, the Herero speakers would sort them into far fewer piles. So it appears that the two groups have categorical differences in how they perceive and organize colors. Now, does this mean that the differences in color